Let me see a show of hands, those of you that are just thinking about a vineyard, maybe in 2-3 years in the future. Let's see a show of hands. One, okay. If you are planting grapes this spring, 2020, let's see a show of hands. All right, a couple more. And then folks that have been in the industry for a while, you've got 5 years of growing grapes under your belts. Okay, so those in the last group know that, farming, this is going to be a talk about all the piles of money you make farming and, what to do with all that money and free time that you have. That's a joke. So we developed some tools and models with the goal of giving new growers a resource that they can use to build a business plan. A lot of folks need to finance a vineyard, and so when you approach a lender, you need to have some order of a business plan and projected cash flows. And that's the majority of what I'm going to show you all here. Another thing before I jump in is just to define all of the information I'm going to show you. It's inside the deer fence and up from the ground. So in all the forecasts I show, I do not include the cost of land. And the other thing I do not include is what happens to the fruit after you grow it. Everything is assuming it's an independent grower situation, so the fruit is sold to another winery at that point. We all know in the wine business there's some value added on the winemaking side. That's not shown in the information I'll show here. Everybody good on that? Great. So before we jump in, growing grapes in the East Coast, there are few places in the world that it's harder to keep grapevines alive. We get a lot of rainfall during the growing season. We're really humid. We have a lot of disease pressure. And on top of that, we can have cold temperatures that kill grapevines, that cause us to lose crop. There's a lot of challenges on the vineyard side here in the East Coast. The flip side of that, and I think what's important for why we see the industry flourishing here in the Mid-Atlantic, is we are in a great place to sell wine. So that's the flip side of this. The last reminder is that there's no magic when you look at these operations that have 30 years of production under their belt. They'll be the first to tell you that there's no magic that makes it all work together. It's just doing every single thing right. And that's an important reminder as we move forward. And on top of that, we're in agriculture, where there's more farms going out of business than we see farms flourishing. So there's a lot of production risk, and the margins are just incredibly lean. So keep that in mind as you move forward. This isn't an investment where you can kind of forget it. This is a lot of hands-on work. The feedback I get from folks that are 5-10 years in the industry is, this is a lot of fun, but I had no idea how much work it was going to take and how much money it was going to take. So you'll hear me emphasizing that a lot today. When we look around at new grape growers in the Mid-Atlantic, very few people operating vineyards and making wine have come from family farms. There's a lot of folks that approach growing grapes as a second career. So if you find yourself in that situation, that's not a bad thing. It just shows that there's a little bit of homework you need to do before moving forward. And that's why it's great that Joe puts on workshops like this, just to bring folks up to speed. No matter what situation you find yourself in, it's important that a new grape grower understands the capital requirements and the labor requirements associated with vineyard enterprise, and that's what we'll talk about. And then secondly, what are the financial expectations of a new grape grower? Again, this is a lot of money that's going to be tied up in the business. So it's not money that you can get out 1 year after you plant a vineyard or 5 years after you plant a vineyard. We're looking farther out for a payback period on this investment. And lastly, and this one's a little bit trickier to define, if you're approaching this as an independent grape grower, so you plan on selling your fruit to a winery, who's going to buy that fruit? We saw a situation in Virginia this year where there were wonderful high quality grapes that were not spoken for. They did not have a home at harvest time. So even though we talk about all the winery demand or appetite for fruit, make sure that you've got a relationship lined up before we get into harvest time. This is not a commodity or spot market. the Mid-Atlantic industry, everybody knows everybody, so reputation is quite important. Relationships are quite important. We've got a lot of resources available to new growers talking about the economics associated with a vineyard enterprise. The Wine Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America, Tony Wolfe, Joe Fiola, a lot of specialists put together information. It's published, it's freely available. Vineyard Financial Calculator is a free tool. I think you have a copy of this on your flash drives. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The Finger Lakes just came out with a benchmark budget for a 50-acre vineyard enterprise. If you want to find that, plug into a search engine, Finger Lakes 2019 vineyard budget, and that will come up. It's a great resource. You'll find that all these resources coming from academic institutions are pretty pessimistic, re-emphasizing that it's hard to make money in this industry. And sometimes new growers are confused because you'll see the academic folks saying, man, this is really difficult, this is really difficult. But then you come to a meeting and you find a lot of very happy people in this industry. The way I'd approach that is that with the academic institutions, we kind of show a average situation for a vineyard enterprise. But in business, you can't be average and succeed. You have to be creative. You have to be very savvy to make an operation that will work for you. Highlighted here, the best information you can probably find is talking to folks that are already in this industry. I can't think of anybody in the wine industry here in the Mid-Atlantic that is guarded about their experience. Everybody's happy to share what has worked on their farm and more than likely what has not worked for them and what mistakes they've made. That's really helpful information to not make the same mistake twice. And then lastly, your own record keeping. Every farm is unique, and so keep track of your cost of productions. That's going to be helpful information as you make your own budgets moving forward. This is a slide I've taken from a dairy economist at Virginia Tech, and it covers everything from starting a new enterprise, but also personal finances. The first point here is that idea of opportunity cost. So when you think about the time and resources that you're going to be plugging into a vineyard, it makes good sense to compare the next best use of those resources. Investing in vacations, investing in a restaurant enterprise. The money that you put into a vineyard is not available for those other uses. And same with time. A lot of time goes into managing a vineyard enterprise. So that's time that you can't spend with grandkids. That's time that you cannot spend going on vacation. There's going to be a lot tied up in the vineyard. 2, make a plan and make sure, at least using pen and paper, that there's a way that you can break even, that you can make money. Unfortunately, I talk to a lot of new growers that have already put a lot of money into their vineyard and they say, well, this is going to make money, right? And really, everybody, it's your responsibility to make that your situation has a path forward. And a last point is, we talk about a 20 or 30-year vineyard. That's a really long time. When we get into forecasts, things get really squirrely when we're talking about that far in the future. And also, people that start vineyards are typically a little bit older. And when you're 65, you've got a lot of capabilities that you may not have when you're 85 as far as managing a vineyard. The rest of the talk, I'm really going to focus on this question of what does it cost to start a vineyard? And I wish that we had one answer that fit all situations, but starting a vineyard is a lot like buying a house. 3-bedroom houses, the price can vary hugely depending on where you are, what materials you're using, so far and so forth. And a vineyard is very much the same way. It's probably going to, there's probably going to be a very different cost of production if you're building a vineyard right here in, I think we're in Baltimore County, or if you're in Southern Maryland, for example. So here's a breakdown for a vineyard that sums up to $22,000, and that is just posts, vines in the ground, not the labor associated with managing that vineyard. And the breakdown really gets to focus in on labor. I'm really happy that Dave spoke about 600 labor hours associated with getting a vineyard up and running, because I think that's a very appropriate number to ballpark. So look at this sum of $22,000. Trellis hardware, posts, wire, etc., that's not too much of it, $3,000. The labor to build that trellis, on the other hand, is summing up 400, 500 labor hours. So depending on the labor rate, I'm showing $6,000, and that's at $13 an hour. It can be hard to find workers at $13 an hour around now. Vines, generally there's different planting densities, but a good ballpark is about 1,000 vines per acre, which sums up at $4 a vine, $4,000 for vines. Labor associated with getting those vines in the ground, somewhere between 200 labor hours, 300 labor hours and up. There's a lot of different options there, whether you're using a labor crew, or you're using a laser planter, or in some cases, you're doing everything yourself. There's just a lot of variability there based on different situations. Deer fence associated with a vineyard, we've got here at $7,000, and that's a very, very squirrely number to pin down. Most vineyards are not 1 acre with a 1 acre perimeter fence. Most vineyards are multiple blocks with a larger perimeter fence surrounding. That's what the $7,000 relates to. Say a 10 acre vineyard spread over 15 acres and then a big perimeter fence. So the deer fence cost per acre, I'm showing here at $7,000. Irrigation, another big set of costs. So $3,000 is just the hardware in the field for 1 acre of irrigation. Not the labor to put it up, and also not the infrastructure behind it to source water from. Whether you're using a pond or a cistern, you've got to have some large capacity of water to use in that irrigation system. The point here thrown at the bottom, whether these are allocated or not allocated, that's something that gets really important when we're building a model. So most people think of costs when they're incurred. You've got, somebody's going to charge you this much money for the trellis hardware. You've got to pay it at that point. A lot of economists like the idea that you allocate those costs over the useful life of that trellis. So instead of paying $3,000 for trellis hardware, that $3,000 is spread over the 25 years that you're using that trellis. So when we show models, we have to show whether those costs are allocated over the useful life or shown when they are incurred. Capital expenditures, so the equipment associated with operating a vineyard. Dave did a great job covering this, but really what you need is a way to cut the grass in the vineyard and a way to spray the grapevines. So that's going to look very different. If you're managing a 20-acre vineyard, you probably do need a 4-wheel drive, 60 horsepower tractor that can run up there and have quite a large cost. If you're planning on a 2-acre vineyard or a 1-acre vineyard, that $60,000 tractor is probably not appropriate for that situation. Maybe using something like a utility vehicle, like a gator or something like that, and a self-powered sprayer is probably going to be more appropriate for the smaller vineyards. In Virginia, our average vineyard size is 5-6 acres, and so those are very tough vineyards to justify $100,000 worth of equipment to manage. Air blast sprayer, you could probably find a $5,000 to $10,000 50-gallon sprayer on up to 300 or 400 gallon sprayers that are closer to $20,000 or $30,000 for that sprayer. Brush hog can be a little bit more standard at $2,500. Hand tools, the list goes on, pruners, hammers, et cetera, et cetera. Especially for the larger vineyards, a lot of folks find things like utility vehicles to be helpful, whether it's an ATV or something like a gator, a pickup truck. It's tough to justify solely for a vineyard enterprise. It's not going to be used all the time. However, grapes have got to be moved around to a cellar at some point, whether you use freight or hire trucking as it's needed. So for, say, a 20 or 30 acre operation, it does sum up to about $100,000 worth of equipment at a minimum and up from there.
I thought that planting a vineyard was an excuse to buy the truck. That's what I was told before.
Yeah. Trucks are now luxury vehicles. All right, so those are the big costs that are associated with a benefit that's long-lived over multiple years. And I'm going to show the annual costs. So the costs that are associated with the benefit right when you use it. So fuel is a good example of an annual cost. So I sum it up a ballpark of about 300 labor hours per acre per year in the vineyard. And it's not evenly allocated over the calendar year. Vineyards are really, really busy from March through the 4th of July, and then again at harvest time. So full-time employment to meet this 300 labor hours, that's a tough fit in some situations. Then we've got skilled labor, so driving tractor, scouting the vineyard, 50 labor hours per acre. Spray materials, $1,000 per acre, and that can go very high depending on what materials are being used. And then lastly, management cost, $1,000 per acre. And management costs are very squishy as well. That'll look very different if you're using a full-time vineyard manager, or you're hiring a consultant, or you're doing it yourself. There's a lot of different scenarios for how decisions are being made for the vineyard enterprise. So this is probably going to be pretty tricky to see, but this is different tasks in the vineyard, such as pruning, tying, et cetera, and then a range for a low estimate or a high estimate for labor hours associated with getting this task done on 1 acre of vineyard. Sums up to over or close to 200 labor hours as a low estimate and close to 400 labor hours for a high estimate. We've ground truthed this with some different operations and looked at their record keeping. Smaller operations, newer operations are closer to 400 labor hours per acre per year, whereas the larger operations, 68 acres to 150 acres, with some more mechanization, they're the ones that are able to achieve this lower 200 labor hours per acre per year. So again, you've got to find people that can do this work, especially during the springtime when most jobs across agriculture and the green industry are spoken for at that time. So again, the only revenue I'll show in this situation is the sale of fruit to a winery. Ballpark prices, $2,000 per ton. That can be modest if we're talking about high quality vinifera. It's probably a little ambitious if we're talking about high quality hybrids. And keep in mind that fruit quality goes downhill very rapidly. So in many situations, we have fruit in vineyards, all the expenses have been incurred in that vineyard to manage that fruit, and the fruit is falling apart, so it's not worth the labor to pick that fruit, which is just a terrible situation to be in, but it can happen very easily here in the East. So just looking at a balance how we did on annual costs on 1 calendar year, $7,000 worth of costs. We looked at a breakdown of that, and then revenue, ambitious yield target of 4 tons per acre of high quality fruit. So we're talking about $8,000 of revenue. So we've only got $1,000 of profit for this enterprise, and we're not getting close to paying off those tractors, the vineyard installation, so on and so forth. So this can be a pretty tough scenario to make it pan out where you're making money. That's the background for how we built this calculator. So it's a scenario analysis tool, which is a fancy way of saying that it's something in Excel that you plug in your variables and it shows instant feedback on. It's a dynamic tool. So you look at the cash flows depending on if you're looking at 20 acres, 30 acres, or 2 acres. It'll cover, especially if you kind of drill down and look under the hood, what are those establishment costs associated with a vineyard. We priced everything out as far as posts, wires, etc. You can find that information through using this calculator and modify if you want to use something different. And it's really a planning tool for new grape growers and a troubleshooting tool for folks with vines in the ground. So if you're looking at scenarios where you're changing labor per acre or yield per acre or any of one of these variables, it'll give you some feedback or output on what that does to the cash flows associated with your vineyard. So this is the dashboard. So I'll just read off the slides that we recommend, or the cells that we recommend you play with. So acres of production, again, 3 acres, 40 acres, plug in whatever is appropriate for you. Crop production level, we use this variable of pounds of crop per foot of row. So depending on vine planting density, it'll show different yield impacts. Labor hours at full production, we'd recommend 300 labor hours, but probably going a little bit higher is appropriate if you're just starting out. And then cost of capital is important, especially if you're looking at some of the net present values that we calculate through this. You can play around with everything else as well, whether it's planting density, whether you're using a deer fence or not, row length, the materials you're using, the Vineyard spray program. You can play around with those as well. This is the output shown on the top where the costs of those capital expenditures are not allocated over the useful life. So for a 30-acre vineyard, you see $600,000 going out in year 1, buying equipment, installing trellis. That's a tough hurdle to pay back. On the bottom, those cash flows allocated over their useful life. So you don't see that big spike up in year 1, but you see that distributed over the useful life of the vineyard. We call a vineyard a 20-year life is what we'd anticipate. But as you all know, some vineyards are killed in year 3. Some vineyards are producing really nice fruit at year 30. It's just something that we cannot forecast at the beginning. Those figures are hard for me to read, and I've been looking at them for a long time, so I like this cumulative cash flow. It's sort of getting at this idea of payback, and so it's showing the costs and the revenue, but cascading from one year to the next, and it's how we get these Nike swoop type pictures. So just to break this down, this is a 30-acre vineyard. On the horizontal axis, we've got a 20-year lifespan, and then we've got cash flows, again, cascading from one year to the next. You'll see this big dip that slowly pays off. So this is all the vineyard installation capital expenditures, and it's still labor going into the vineyard in those first couple years when there's no fruit being produced, there's no revenue coming back out. Then we get into crop production, and we slowly pay back that initial investment. It's very easy to modify the slope of this curve. And so, for example, if you spend $70,000 of equipment for a 2-acre vineyard, this curve's never going to pay itself off. It's just going to be flat down here. Whereas if you can spend less money on equipment, buy used equipment, for example, and increase your crop production, this slope will get a lot steeper. So again, there's a number of things you can do to get instant feedback through the tool. I can't say this enough. Vineyards are very labor intensive and capital intensive. When we think about payback associated with a vineyard, 15 years is sort of an optimum payback period. In most cases, it's going to be a slower payback than that, is off that initial investment. Factors that influence crop production, a yield of high quality fruit, those are good things, and those are going to generate more revenue associated with the vineyard. And that's why at new grower workshops, we spend so much time talking about site selection, variety selection, because if you plant a vineyard that's killed in the first winter, you've sunk a lot of money into an enterprise that has no hope to pay that money back. So excellent vineyard site is worth its weight in gold. Matching equipment to the scale of the vineyard is another factor that's very important. Experienced management, that can help as well to make the right decision, spend a little bit less labor in the vineyard. And variety to site matching is really tricky in the Mid-Atlantic, especially with the variability we have between years, but finding varieties that do well in great years like 19, as well as tough years like 18, that's going to be in your benefit. And in some cases, having a mixed bag of varieties, some more durable varieties like hybrids, and then some more tricky varieties like Chardonnay are probably going to make sense for you. With that, that's my last slide. If there's any questions about the tool. Yeah, it looks like I did a good job. Everybody's really excited about planting vineyards.
Questions for Tremain? I warned you, we are going to try you scare you out of this.
Mm-hmm.
We just want you to be realistic. And you see part of the reasons that we keep talking about that most of the vineyard acreage is under wineries, because as Tremain mentioned, that value added part makes the difference between this little profit margin and the large profit margin. But there's also an economy of scale that Tremain talked about a little bit, and Joyce will be talking about later. When you get to a certain size, all those initial inputs are much more efficient. You need the same tractor whether you have 1 acre or 40 acres or 50 acres. The same tractor works for you. So obviously it's more efficient to have a larger scale. And we're going to be talking about that later today as well as tomorrow. Questions, please.
I think that payback graph you showed, if you're not serious about it, you're in the wrong business.
Mm-hmm.
That's
15 years, that's a stretch.
That's extreme.
Absolutely. The other thing I'll say though is grapes are a high value crop, and we are in a good place to grow them. If you're to compare the possibilities on a 10-acre operation between hay, beans, corn, those are dismal numbers as well. So opportunity costs associated with those different factors in agriculture, grapes still look pretty good. Yes, sir?
Probably didn't mention, where is this tool available?
It's free, available online. Just plug in Vineyard Financial Calculator. I think y'all have a copy on your flash drive.
On your flash drive.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I'll emphasize is we tend to be a little pessimistic on the industry. I think it's good to match what you hear in a workshop like this with folks that are in the industry, because folks that have been in the industry for a while will have some perspective about how to make this work, how they've made this work for them. So their feedback will be useful.
And that's one of the things that Joyce has been doing. She's been working with some of the top growers in the state who are willing to share their numbers and talking to them about number of people per acre and how what's the most efficient number. Do you need a backup tractor, or can you get rid of one at what point? So she's been working with not only just the theoretical numbers, but she's been working with commercial growers, multiple ones that have given her feedback and saying, well, here's the model I use, and she's been putting it together, and that's very helpful to be able to do that. The other thing is in the East, we have a wide range of costs or prices that the wines are going for. There is this model, not all the wineries and vineyards work with this, but in general, they say that depending on what the bottle price is, so your quality of the grapes you have go into a wine that then determines the price. If you have mediocre grapes, you have $15 bottle wine. If you have premium grapes that are wonderful, you can get into a $60 to $70 bottle wine. If you use, I think, $2,000 a ton. So typically, if you're selling $2,000 a ton, that's 20. That's a $20 bottle of wine. Typically, a $2,000 a ton wine grapes go into a $20 bottle of wine in general. But if you sell them to a winery and they're getting $40 or $50 because you're producing real premium grapes and they're getting a premium price, you might be able to negotiate up to possibly $30 or $3,000 a ton, $4,000 a ton to go into that $40 to $50 bottle of wine. It's going to take a history of your site, history of the cultivars you have, and history of the quality you can produce consistently to do that. But it makes sense for the winery. The winery can afford to pay $4,000 a ton for a $40 bottle of wine. So that's all within the negotiation has to work that way, but it can happen.
I just have a little question, a comment. Based on the break-even scenario, which would take maybe 15 years, you made a comment that when we talked to other growers, a lot of happy people in this. At least they have been drinking their wine. That's a real. I understand there's a lot of people smile here, but what's keeping them? Is it a passion or?
It is a fun industry, and I will say that. And also, my folks and I operate a farm, and we grow grapes and make wine. And it's a much better use of our farm than beef cattle, for example. So in our situation, we're pretty happy with what we can do growing grapes, making wine, selling that wine.
Basic cost per acre, you make a little more.
Yeah, 300 labor hours, you could manage 200 or 300 acres of pasture land, but there's not that much revenue potential on that. But the reason that, as far as a model, we stop at the deer fence is the cost of production associated with winemaking could be everything from using a garage to building a $3 million building. So there's so much variation there. To make it more concrete, we stop at the deer fence.
One more question, then we're going to break.
Is there a way to factor in whether productivity financially for an organic crop versus a crop that's traditionally grown? Obviously, spraying costs, insecticide costs, but
yeah, we've got 2 certified operations in Virginia, and they'd be the first to tell you that their crop quality is lower and the production costs are a lot higher. So labor, spray costs, fuel costs. You can manage a vineyard with organic tools, but you're spraying every 3 days. So
You're spraying sulfur chemicals, you're spraying much more frequently.
Yeah.
Instead of spraying 8 to 14 times, you're spraying 20 to 25 times.
yeah.
there is spraying that's happening.
Oh, there's more spraying.
Mhm.
And a higher risk
Yeah.
of damage. And regretfully, now, I don't know if you've seen in Virginia, there doesn't seem to be the premium price for organic wine. For organic vegetables and other things, yes, people pay a premium. Organic wine at this point, for the average consumer, it's not worth the price.
Yeah.
They're
And
not willing to pay the extra.
another catch there too is with organic production, you're not growing the same varieties that most commercial vineyards are growing. You're even limited with the hybrids on what might work for you. So say Vidal Blanc, that's really tough to produce organically. It's just got too much sensitivity to black rot. So you're growing really off the general path varieties.